Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today on this episode, let's talk about finding and fishing brush piles. Brush piles are probably one of the best offshore types of cover that are available to fish as habitat, and really most of the time it is man-placed habitat. So a lot of people will go out there, sink their own brush piles, maybe Christmas trees. A lot of brush piles seem to appear after Christmas, but you know, Christmas trees, maybe they're artificial brush. There's all different types of brush piles out there. Some big, some small. You know, some placed in very obvious areas and some that are just out in the middle of nowhere, but all of them will attract fish at some point. And so I just wanted to go through my system for finding and fishing this type of cover. And as with any video that I do, kind of trying to teach you guys how I do something, it's very customizable. So you can customize your approach based on your style of fishing and things like that. But I'm going to show you the basics and how I you know, find it and fish it, just on a very basic level. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we get started, I want to show you the electronic setup that we're going to be using today. We've got a full Lowrance electronic system. We've got two HGS 12 Pros here at the console and two more on the bow. And here at the console, we're going to be using the 3-in-1 transducer that's installed on the jack plate. And all of this was installed by BassmasterElectronics.com. That's why it is, you know, it is clear as can be. It's working great. They are amazing. So if you're looking to buy or install electronics, check them out. But we've got this full Lowrance electronic system. Side scan is going to be a big deal for fishing for brush piles or finding them. And then once we get on the bow, of course, we've got active target 2, which is going to be a big deal, as well as, you know, just the anchor mode on the Ghost trolling motor. So let's go ahead, get started, find some brush piles, and then go fish them. All right, so the very first thing that I want to talk about is like the general areas you want to start idling around and looking with your electronics. And really, that search starts with mapping. Good topography, good topographic maps are really, really important because most brush piles are going to be strategically placed in locations that are associated with some type of structure. So like a long tapering point or a hump or a creek channel winding through a flat. Those type of areas are generally where people put brush piles. Usually, you know, anglers that are putting brush piles out for habitat for bass are generally trying to attract fish that are already relating to some type of structure, but they're trying to attract them to a specific target. And so it is really important to be able to eliminate a lot of water when you first get to a lake. And so looking for brush piles around structure, usually on the drops on like points and things like that, is going to be a high percentage approach. All right, so having good mapping is really, really key. But once we get the mapping down and we get into a general area, it's all about side scan. Okay, side scan is really important. And usually when I'm fishing side scan or using side scan to find things, you know, I'll usually keep it 100 foot or less generally from side to side. But with brush piles, I'll go way out. And the reason for that is because I can spot a brush pile, you know, even if I have my side scan out to like 180 feet, I can spot it pretty far, depending on the size of the brush pile. And the main thing that I look for is not necessarily the brush pile itself, that bright indication, that bright kind of you know, fluffy ball that looks like a brush pile. I like to look for the shadow that corresponds with it. That tends to be a little bit more defined and easy to pick out of a wide area. So for instance, let's go ahead and start looking here. I bet we can find one. In fact, I know that there's a couple brush piles here. And so I'm just looking around, I'll be idling around, and I primarily am going to look for shadows. But sometimes the shadows, depending on how you're idling past them and how far away they are, you know, this right here, you can see this little bright spot, that is a brush pile. I know that because I've actually fish that brush pile. But a bright spot is going to be a big indicator. But as you can see here, this is what I look for the most, because sometimes the bright spot is harder to see, especially if it's placed on a hard bottom, but you could see that shadow clear as day. And that is a big indicator that there is a brush pile there. So if you have like a big wide shadow that corresponds with something on the bottom, usually you've got a brush pile type situation, or at least something that you want to fish. And so shadows are a really, really big key on my side scan for finding good brush. So there we go, we've got some brush. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and place a waypoint on that brush. I always like to do the tree, and sometimes I'll change the colors to denote different types of brush. So like if it's a big brush pile versus a smaller one, I might do it a different color, like red or something like that. And then go ahead and save that. I already have a marker on this brush pile, so I'm just gonna go ahead and press cancel. But always mark your brush pile. And then the next thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna turn around. I'm gonna go downwind of that brush pile. I always want to make sure that I am downwind, so I can put the Lowrance Ghost down, hit anchor mode, and be pointing directly at that brush pile. And you want to angle it so you're not only downwind, but you're exactly downwind to the point where if you have your anchor mode on, you're pointed directly at that brush pile. So your trolling motor is actually still pointing directly at that brush pile. So that's how we're going to position, and then we'll get on the bow in just a minute here. All right. So right here, we've got the wind kind of coming this direction. So we're gonna make sure that we kind of get to, you know, downwind, but also a little bit further this way before we hit anchor mode. And one thing that I think is really, really key is the distance that you want to keep between you and the brush pile. And usually, if you're using active target, you really want to be within 60 or 70 feet, but really not any closer than that. You don't want to spook those fish. You want to kind of sneak in there and get positioned to where you can make it on a reasonable cast and an accurate cast, but you're not too close to those fish. All right, I'm starting to see the brush pile right there. It's a very bright spot, and I'm gonna get it right at the 60 to 70 foot range. That's where I'm gonna keep this brush pile at when I put it on anchor mode. And another thing that's really important when you're approaching a brush pile and fishing a brush pile is the heading extension on your Lowrance. All right, so having that extension line to help you perfectly line up with the brush pile is really important. So that right there, we're a little bit closer than I'd like, but that's all right. That's where we'll put it. So it's kind of just a little bit to the left of the bow here. And so we're lined up, we're on anchor mode, and we should be able to go ahead and start fishing. So to start fishing here, I think that really you want to just get back to basics with brush pile fishing. And probably the most basic and effective technique that you could fish a brush pile with is a just traditional Texas rig. We've got a 1/4 ounce weight here. We've got a little bead on there, so like a flipping bead to make a little bit of extra noise. I put a bobber stop ahead of my Texas rig just to keep the weight and the bait a little bit, you know, more compact and close together so they're not separating too much. And then we've got the Hayabusa EWG hook. This is, or not EWG, it's just a regular offset shank hook. And we're using the Z-Man Mag Fatties. This is just a really good overall straight tail worm to fish in a brush pile. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the fun part. This is the fun part. And using active target really allows you to line up. And so that's what I'm gonna do. I'm actually, the boat kind of turned to the side a little bit, which is kind of surprising. So I have to find the brush pile with, you have to find that cast with the active target, and it's about right there. Oh yeah, there we go. That's the cast. And really from here, man, a traditional Texas rig is so good at fishing brush piles just because it is so weedless. It's so, you know, it's so effective at coming through that cover. And really when I'm fishing there's a fish right there. There's a fish right there. Little guy. That is why brush piles are just so good. They are such great fish habitat. Well, that's a perfect example right there. And sometimes, you know, a Texas rig isn't going to be the only bait that you want to throw, or even the primary bait that you want to throw. There's a lot of different baits that you can throw when fishing a brush pile, and some are reaction baits, so, you know, where you're more working it above the brush pile. Like if I go to Eufaula, Alabama, for instance, that lake is known for fishing spinner baits above those brush piles, okay? Because it imitates those schools of shad that occasionally, you know, just swim above those brush piles, and the fish are there to ambush them. Also, swim baits are really good for swimming over brush piles. But as far as like other baits that you can throw that are more slow moving around brush piles, you can throw a drop shot. You want to make sure that you Texas rig your drop shot worms to make it more weedless. You could also fish you can fish a Carolina rig, though it's not my favorite. And you can fish a jig, although it's not my favorite. But man, it's hard to beat a good old Texas rig when you're fishing a brush pile. And if you're just learning how to fish a brush pile, a Texas rig is going to be your best option. But I'm going to stop talking here, and we're just going to go ahead and catch some fish. Oh yeah, look at that. Oh yeah. See my bait go down there, right into the center of that brush. There's a bite right there. Oh, that's a better fish. Not better, but still fun. And some brush piles, man, are just absolutely loaded. And you can catch a bunch of fish on them. But one of the things that you're always going to find with brush piles is that they're going to turn off at some point. You know, maybe you catch all the fish, or maybe, you know, the fish just aren't biting at that time. And it's really important to have a bunch of brush piles, you know, located so you can rotate through them and do kind of a milk run type situation where you're trying to get your timing right, and you're just working them, you know, at different times. And if you're not catching fish, if you're going to a lot of brush piles and you're not catching fish, try mixing up your rotation of those brush piles. That may actually make a big difference. You know, another thing that I need to mention as far as boat positioning, you know, if you're in deeper water, it's usually, when you're fishing brush piles, you're probably in 10 foot or more, but not always. There's sometimes that you can fish a shallower flat and you know, be in like 4 to 6 foot of water or something like that. In that scenario, you don't necessarily have to be downwind. In fact, if it's a really shallow flat or shallow area where you're able to position your boat and make a cast to a brush pile, using your power poles can be even more effective, because then you have your trolling motor free to be able to use your active target to locate and make the exact cast that you need to make. And so what I'll do in those situations is, if I can, I will go upwind of the brush piles, drop my power poles, and fish you know, be casting downwind. And I think that that works even better, but it's not often that you get in a scenario like that. Today we can't, you know, I'd have to be way back there to be able to use my power poles instead of anchor mode. And so sometimes that doesn't work. A lot of times it doesn't work, but if you can use your power poles, it's so much better to be upwind casting downwind. So it's just the exact opposite of what we're doing here with the Ghost. All right, I think I've pretty much, you know, turned off the bite on this brush pile, so we're going to move to the next one. And the next one is not too far away, but we need to make sure that we don't get right on top of it. And again, we want to line up the boat correctly, okay? And this one's not as thick of a brush pile by any means, but we're going to get downwind to the point where we're pointing directly at it, or at least getting close to directly at it, just because, you know, it's so much easier to make precise casts and to make that right cast if your boat is pointing the way, is pointing towards that brush pile. So whenever possible, you want to be able to do this. You know, another thing I want to point out is that, you know, obviously I'm keeping the brush pile a little bit closer than the 60 or 70 feet that I said I like to do, or keep it at. But that's mostly because we got a pretty heavy wind right now that is making it very difficult to make long casts. So that's the reason why we're breaking that rule. This brush pile is a lot smaller. By a pretty good margin. Oh yeah, and I'm nowhere near it. I'm nowhere near it. There we go. I see a fish that just followed my bait down too. In fact, I'm going to take it off anchor mode and just be able to, just so I could see my bait. There we go, we're in the brush pile. Come on, I know you're there. There's a fish. There we go. Lots of little guys in the brush today. There we go. One thing that's really important is if you can't use active target to line up your cast every single time, because your Ghost or whatever trolling motor you have is on anchor mode. You want to make sure that you use active target to line up your cast, and then find something on the shoreline ahead of you that you can use as a marker to cast to. Like over there, the culvert is where that brush pile is. So as long as I make a cast directly at that culvert, that seems to be where that brush pile is. So if there's a marker on the bank somewhere that you can cast to, that's just as good as using active target. All right, anyways guys, you get the point. Brush piles are a great type of cover for bass fishing and also crappie fishing. And in finding them and fishing them is not that difficult if you know what you're looking for and you know how to position your boat and what baits to throw. Those are really the biggest keys when fishing brush piles. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions at all, drop me a comment below. Other than that, make sure that you like, share, subscribe if you enjoy this content. I'm gonna see you out on the water, make sure you trust the process.